The Leica Q2 is one of my most favorite cameras, and people following me on my channel, they know how much I love this little compact full-frame camera with its 28mm lens. And there was one property of the firmware of the Leica Q2 I didn't like, and it's actually something which is also existent on the Leica M series cameras, and I demonstrated this in a video. I post a link below in the info box on the Leica Q2 and the Leica M10P that there is an embedded constraint between ISO values and shutter speed or exposure time. And that is something which I found annoying and also completely unnecessary, because other manufacturers also give you full flexibility about combinations of ISO and exposure time. Now, Leica just released a couple of months ago a firmware update for the Leica Q2. And it is update 2.0, which means you upgrade from 1.0 to 2.0, which already suggests that this should be a major upgrade. And they have here all the new features, all the updates listed on their website. And I'm going to install that now on my Leica Q2. And we'll see if this constraint between ISO and exposure time has been removed, and also look into a few of the other new features here. Getting the firmware is simple. You just scroll down on the website here. You come to firmware update. You find Leica Q2 firmware update 2.0, and then you can push the download button. In this way, transfer the firmware update to your computer, your Mac or your PC, then copy it to an SD card, get the SD card into the Leica Q2 and start the firmware update, but I'm going to show this in the main part of the video anyway. Before you start the upgrade procedure, and that's the same for all cameras, you need to make sure you have a fully charged battery in front of you, because you don't want the camera to get stuck in the middle of an upgrade procedure, because then you might not be able to wake it up again. You also saw that I downloaded the new firmware already on my MacBook, and I placed it already on the SD card. The SD card is in the compartment at the bottom of the camera, so this is all good. And the battery in front of me is fully charged. I just had it in the charger to make sure it's at 100%. So let's insert this now in the battery compartment. And let's also mount the hand grip again. And people following me on my channel, they know that I love this kind of hand grips, because it avoids the risk of letting the camera slip. But before we start the upgrade procedure, let's get the Leica Q2 out of sight and let's have a look at the Leica SL2. The SL2 had, right from scratch when it was shipped, a menu status screen, and that is something very convenient. So let's push the menu button, and then we come into the status screen, and we have all relevant important information on one screen here. And since the Leica SL2 has a touch sensitive screen, you can easily operate the camera by using the touchscreen functionality. I should probably mention that I'm not a touchscreen person, but once I got used to it, I really started to appreciate it, because you can push all different sections here. You can change the values by swipe, or you're also using the control wheel, and it's something very convenient. And I already said when I saw this by the end of last year on the SL2, that should be also included in the Q2 via firmware upgrade. So let's switch off now the Leica SL2, let's get it out of sight, and let's turn our attention again to the Leica Q2. And let's start the firmware upgrade procedure, switching the camera on, and then going into the menu, and in the menu scrolling down to the main menu, then pushing that button, and then going to the last page, we find the section camera information. That shows firmware 1.0 here. So let's push the button again, and let's go to start update. It should recognize the firmware on the SD card automatically. Yes, it's showing me update firmware to version 2.0. So let's go here to yes. And then when I push that button and confirm, I get another question if I want to save my profiles on the SD card. So that's your decision if you want to do that. I have no problem adjusting the camera and customizing it from scratch, because it makes me rethink what I set up in the camera almost a year ago, which is sometimes good, costs a few minutes. So let's go for the update now. Let's not store the profiles. And this will take a while, and I will switch off the video in the meanwhile and come back when the upgrade is completed. So here I'm back, update successful, that's the message from the camera. Please restart the camera, so we switch it off. And what I also typically do is not an instruction manual, but I remove the battery for a few seconds to make sure it's really reset. I don't think you have to do this, it's just a habit of myself, which I do. So let's get the battery in again, let's mount the hand grip again, and then we'll see what that update brought to us in terms of new features and hopefully lots of improvements. So let's now switch on the camera and let's see what we got. We have to customize the camera from scratch. I'm not showing this here because I've done it before, but the basic settings like language, time and so on, I'm sure I have to do them from the beginning because of the new firmware and the reset. By the way, nice animation, Leica, well done. So here we start with language. I stick with English. Like always, we have date and time. I think the time zone, yes, is correct. Wetzlar, Berlin, Madrid, Paris. Daylight saving time, fine, we keep that. Date setting, 3rd of May 2020, fine. Time, looking it up on my watch, is not correct. I don't know why, but maybe I had the battery out for too long some time ago. So we have 3 p.m, yes, but it's close to 4 p.m, so this should be something like 59, and then storing the time here. Of course, I'm curious now to check whether that status screen we know from the Leica SL2 has also been implemented on the Leica Q2. So I think that's the first thing I want to figure out, and going into the menu, pushing the menu button and checking whether I get that status screen. Here we go, the status screen is there. Well done, Leica, that's something I asked for and probably many other users asked for. So if we put the Leica SL2 side by side, we see these status screens are comparable. We got that feature also on the Leica Q2, and that gives, I think, a new dimension of operating the camera in the same way as I'm knowing it from the Leica SL2. So we can now touch the different sections here. We can swipe and change those values with the control wheel or with our fingers. Very nice. So let's look at a few other features. Going back into the status screen and swiping or also pushing the video section here. Let me adjust my exposure on my filming camera here. Then you have now all the manual options. So you can change your aperture. You see I'm closing the aperture more here. You can go all the way back to the widest open aperture of 1.7. You can adjust on the exposure dial your shutter speed. You have all different options. You can adjust your ISO. So here we can swipe and change the ISO values. So that's actually very good. You have now all the manual options in video filming, and you see here the microphone level actually indicated. That's exactly the same as on the Leica SL2, and I think that's a very good upgrade and a good feature to have. Another feature you have is now touch and release, and you could already on the former firmware actually touch somewhere. Let's get the beep to actually make this visible. So you hear the camera beeping, it locked the autofocus in, depending on where you touch, which is quite nice. But now you can also in the menu change this not only to touch and focus, but touch, focus and release. And that is done on the first page of the main menu. Let's go there. And then you go into focusing. And on focusing you have touch autofocus. And if you go into that section, you can have off. So if you touch, nothing happens. If you touch, it focuses, or touch, autofocus and release. Let's try this. We go back and I'm going to touch now here. And you see how the shot has been taken. I need to go back from the preview. Again, it took the shot. So I could now zoom in here and basically look if everything is in focus. So I'm not going to use that feature, so I switch it off again, because that typically leads to image taking, which I didn't originally want. So let's go back to touch autofocus, and let's go back to only touch autofocus and not release here. But there is another feature you can use now. So if I place my focus field here, I can touch and hold the screen. And then you see some little red markings here. And now I can, with the focus wheel, make the field larger in 3 different sizes, or smaller, depending on what size you're coming from. So this is the largest one. this is the medium one, and this is the smallest one. I try to focus here, then I think you see it better. So touch and stay, and now you see here these little red dots in the corners, so I can make it medium, large, medium, small. That is a feature which was not implemented before and I think is quite nice. Another feature is hidden in the menu under the display settings. So let's go into the menu. Let's go to, it's the third page, and then you go into display settings. And on display settings at the bottom, you now have the option to change your EVF frame rate. 60 frames per second is the standard, but you can also go to 120 frames per second. And that gives you a more fluent image in the electronic viewfinder. Means if you move the camera fast, you will not suffer from any motion blur, which is nice. But I mean, be aware, if you have the double frame rate here, you very likely will also consume more battery power, and it might drain your battery more quickly than if you stay at 60 frames per second. So I think this is something you should use if you really need it. I switched on the light by now because we have bad weather in Zurich and it's getting really dark. So the main thing I wanted to test, and maybe I should start differently, I should say there are many more things to say about that firmware upgrade. What we saw so far is good. On the positive side, we have that status screen now we wanted to have from the Leica SL2, exactly the same functioning. We can adjust the size of the field in field autofocus. We can even get the frame rate up to 120 frames per second on the EVF. So there are many good things. We have manual video mode, which is nice. So we can do here all the adjustments we want in terms of shutter speed and aperture and ISO value. That's all very good and very nice. But what I really wanted to test is, do we still have these exposure constraints, which I posted almost a year ago on my channel, where there was a strong relation between the ISO value and between the exposure time, which you could not break or change. So let's try to figure this out now, how this is working here. So let's first of all choose an ISO value of 100. And here on my exposure dial, I'm now at 1+ here. So this is adjusted to 1+. Then I can steer my exposure time via that control wheel here on the right-hand side. And I can now turn this wheel and increase my exposure time. And on the former firmware, this was going up to 120 seconds. I guess that's still the case. Yes, 120 seconds, then you end up in T. So 120 seconds is good. That means you can have 2 minutes taking exposures at an ISO of 100. But now what happens if you increase your ISO value to 200? Your exposure time, and that's the maximum now before you come to T, is again constrained to 60 seconds. And that's very disappointing in my opinion, because there is no reason to impose this limitation to the photographer. And other camera brands, they don't have that, even in small camera bodies. But here Leica seems to have, and that's my own personal speculation, to have an issue with heating up of the sensor or what have you. I don't know what's driving them to put these constraints on the camera. And the pattern is very simple. So we have now an ISO of 200. Let's double the ISO value to 400. And then the exposure time is cut by half from 60 seconds to 30 seconds. Let's go up one more. Factor of 2 from 400 to 800. Now it's again cut by half from 30 seconds to 15 seconds. And the next stop then on the exposure dial is actually the T mode. And you cannot go higher than 15 seconds. And for some people doing serious astrophotography, this might become a problem, because astrophotography you do typically at 1600 or even 3200 of ISO, and then your exposure time is boiling down to 4 seconds. This is way off too short, because you can easily have exposure time of, let's say, 20-25 seconds. Well, 25 seconds probably the start to dash. But I think 20 seconds is fine. But here you can only up to 4 seconds, which is not good enough in my opinion. So this all would not be a big problem if the T mode would really be a bulb mode as described in the manual by Leica for the Q2. But Leica already mentions in the manual, and I show this here in a moment, that the T mode is a bulb mode. That means you press the shutter button and you basically release your finger, and then the shutter remains open until you press that button again. But Leica mentions in the manual that this is independence of ISO, a maximum of 2 minutes, and ISO value, if you increase it, can basically turn the maximum bulb potential down to the constraints we saw already here when we played with the 4 seconds. And I'm going to demonstrate this quickly. So I'm going now from 4 seconds, which is the maximum here on an ISO of 3200. I'm going now up to the T mode. And let me just get, this will be overexposed, but who cares? Let's get the shot and let's see if this is true. So now I press the shutter button, and then it's taking exposure as long as I do not push the shutter button again. But here it already stopped, so that image is only 4 seconds. So there is no real bulb mode like you know it from other cameras on the Leica Q2. And that's a shame, having these limitations, having this dependence between ISO and shutter speed, and also having no real bulb mode. This really is not what people want. And I can only say, my dear Leica, if you bring the next firmware update, remove this. And if you think it's damaging the camera based on heat, then get your sensor heating issues under control, because people should have the freedom to shoot at 3400 of ISO and get more than a 4-second exposure. I conclude the video here. So Leica really brought good improvements to the Leica Q2. That status screen is nice. All the features I showed, they are useful. They make a very good camera even better. But the elephant in the room, the big problem, the exposure constraints, the limitations that if you go for a higher ISO value, you are limited in your exposure time, that has not been removed. And that's disappointing. So I can only say to Leica, please, in the next firmware update, remove these limitations, because I would not see any good reasons why they are necessary. And I think it's time to get this in the usual degrees of freedom a photographer wants to have, in being free to choose the ISO you want to choose and the exposure time. And if the camera gets hot, maybe you switch it off and try your luck at a different time. If you liked my video, please give me a thumbs up. If you like my channel, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and healthy, and peace out.